Have you ever noticed how often Jesus says to his disciples and followers, "Do not be afraid"? Have you ever noticed the context in which he says this? Think, for example, of when Jesus helped Simon Peter to a great catch of fish, and Peter falls on his knees before him with the words, "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Jesus simply replies, "Do not be afraid. I will make you a fisher of people." Again, when Jesus walks on the water, he says to the disciples in the boat, "Courage, it's me, do not be afraid." Or we see Jairus after his servants come to tell him not to bother the master because his daughter has died. And Jesus says to him, "Do not be afraid, only have faith, and she will be saved." Similarly, Jesus chastises one or the other of his disciples for their fearfulness, which for Jesus is the equivalent of a lack of faith. When Peter starts walking on the water, but becomes terrified by the wind and the waves, Jesus says to him, "You have so little faith, why did you doubt?" Indeed, at one point, Jesus says to all the disciples in the boat in the midst of a storm, "Why are you so frightened, you who have so little faith?" Now, there are two things to notice in these incidents. First, the disciples are usually frightened by something powerful and overwhelming, something they have no control over. Fear takes over, and Jesus has to assure them that he is with them and he is in control. But second, and we see this with Jairus or the Syrophoenician woman or the woman with a blood bleed, people are terrified when there is a manifestation of God's power. Even the angel Gabriel says to Mary, "Do not be afraid, for you have found favor with God." God's power takes us out of our ordinary world where things are familiar, even if painful, and frightens us because deep down we are more comfortable with our own world. And so Jesus says to us, "Do not be afraid. God is at work here, and you need to stand in awe, but not fearfulness." Now, we today may not think that we encounter the extraordinary intervention of God in our lives, but I suspect that when we pay attention, we should stand in awe at how God touches us with healing and strength and courage and trust. For example, I recall when my mother was dying of bone cancer, which is not a pleasant journey, but she was thrilled during her last weeks because of a volunteer who came to sit with her at times. And I'll never forget my mom saying with some awe in her voice, "Here I am dying, and I made a new friend." In our society, we take so much for granted, as if we are owed a living. We tend to lose touch with the God who cares for us daily. In many Catholic homes today, for example, families do not even say grace before meals. And that troubles me, because if a famine were to occur, the first one to be blamed would be God. And yet, we often cannot see God's goodness and generosity when it is right in front of our noses. So listen to God speaking to you each day, saying, "Do not be afraid." He is telling us who is in charge. He is asking us to live by a confident faith in Him and in His goodness, and to do so with a sense of awe and wonder at this daily goodness. But now you might recall the other side of fear, when the storm is raging, when you are sinking in the water, or when an army marches into your town and, as happens in parts of the world today, begins killing Christians. Fear, human fear, is a completely natural and understandable emotion as a first response. But I was amazed when speaking one time with an Iraqi family who had been forced out of their home in Iraq just because they were Christians. They had spent several years in a refugee camp, but were now building a new life in Canada. Very simply, the mother said to me, "It is sad what is happening, but God is in charge, and we trust God above all guns and weapons and even death itself. We even forgive those who hate us, for that is what Jesus did." I cannot even imagine what it would be like to go through what this family went through, but I stand in awe of their faith. Indeed, what strikes me is that faith is the opposite not of doubt, but of fear. And when we face our fears, we begin to learn who is in control, and that we can trust our God with our very lives.